King Henry VIII of England is historically renowned for three interconnected actions: his treatment of his 6 wives, the separation of England from the Catholic Church, and his relentless pursuit of a male heir, which culminated in the birth of Edward VI in 1537. Henry's desire for a son is often critically examined, especially since his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, also ascended to the throne. In fact, Elizabeth is considered one of England's greatest monarchs, leading some to overlook Edward entirely. However, this perspective is incomplete and disservice to Henry and Edward. For the final 14 years of his life, the controversial Tudor king was justified in his urgent need for a male heir. Without Edward, the likelihood of a Queen Mary or a Queen Elizabeth ascending the throne would have been slim. The third act of succession, passed in 1544, is the best evidence of this. This act is often cause for a surprise. Henry restored his daughters to the line of succession but did not legitimize them. They were intended to protect his son and counterbalance each other. Despite being a man tormented by pain and depression who had become a tyrant, Henry demonstrated his shrewd political acumen one last time. Anyone who studies Tudor history is well aware of the significance of January 24, 1536. On this date, Henry VIII sustained a serious injury while jousting. He was not only unconscious for 2 hours, but the injuries to his leg from a similar event 9 years earlier also resurfaced. This time, his other leg was affected as well, leading to the formation of open, foul-smelling ulcers that would never heal. Henry's mobility became increasingly limited. Sumptuous meals and alcohol became his pain management. By 1540, he relied on a walking stick, and a few years later, he needed to be carried. His body weight more than doubled, and his health continually deteriorated. Constant infections plagued him, exacerbated by his unhealthy diet. Throughout the 1540s, Henry was often closer to death than to life. Essentially, he began a slow and painful decline from 1536 onward, which posed a significant problem for the succession. Mary and Elizabeth were excluded until 1544, while Edward was privileged by a law predating his birth, referring to potential children Henry would have with Jane Seymour. At that time, the assumed heiress was Margaret Douglas, but she had little support because she adhered to the old faith. Henry VIII faced a deeply troubling scenario. What would happen if there was no Edward, or if Edward became king at too young an age to comprehend his role? During Catherine Howard's time, there was a realistic fear that his 4- or 5-year-old son could fall under the influence of men like Francis Derham or Thomas Culpeper, both of whom aspired to marry the Queen after Henry's death. Edward, after all, no longer had a mother, and Henry did not trust Edward or Thomas Seymour enough for a regency, and his own health got worse and worse. In February 1541, the French ambassador wrote,
"The king's life was really thought to be in danger, not from fever, but from the leg which often troubles him."
Henry couldn't appoint Mary as his heir because she would reverse the separation from Rome. Elizabeth, only 4 years older than Edward, was also too young and, as the second-born daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, unlikely to be supported by Mary. If Edward were to die, a civil war seemed likely after Henry's death. The Protestants would not have accepted Mary's rule, as the Wyatt Rebellion during her reign later underscored. Elizabeth would not have been able to assert herself since she still was very young herself. In other words, Henry needed his son to ensure a clear and peaceful succession. Neither Mary nor Elizabeth would have permanently supported the other sibling or another sister. Therefore, the king not only had to keep the crown prince alive, but also safe. Ironically, His daughters were ideally suited for this task, so much so that Henry codified it into law. Officially, the law on succession was enacted to secure the monarchy amidst the impending war with France. The legal provision states,
"Our said most dread sovereign lord the king, upon good and just grounds and causes, intendeth by God's grace to make a voyage royal in his majesty's most royal person into the realm of France, against his ancient enemy the French king, his highness most prudently and wisely considering and calling to his remembrance how this realm standeth at this present time in the case of succession."
However, the true intent of this legislation is evident from its commonly accepted name: Act Fixing the Succession. This was not its official title, as there were no formal titles at the time. Instead, laws were simply catalogued in order. 35 Henberdis 8. C. 1. This notation means law in the 35th year of the reign of Henry VIII. The C1 indicates that it was the first law of that parliamentary session. Once again, Edward was confirmed as the primary heir. If he had children, they would continue the line.
The first son of his body between his highness and his then lawful wife, Queen Jane, now deceased, begotten, and to the heirs of the body of the same first son, lawfully begotten.
Mary was not ranked second. This position was reserved for potential children Henry might have with his then wife, Catherine Parr.
His highness shall have heirs begotten and procreated between his majesty and his said most dear and entirely beloved wife, Queen Catherine.
Following this was a provision that is hard not to view with irony. As with his sixth wife, the law's authors, with Henry's approval, apparently decided to cover all bases.
Or any lawful heirs and issues hereafter of his own body begotten by any other his lawful wife.
Mary was next in line.
The said imperial crown and all other the premises shall be to the Lady Mary, the King's Highness's daughter, and to the heirs of the body of the same Lady Mary, lawfully begotten, with such conditions as by his Highness shall be limited by his letters, patents under his great seal, or by his Majesty's last will in writing, signed with his gracious hand.
The designation Lady Mary underscored her illegitimate status, as she would have been referred to as Princess Mary. Otherwise, Elizabeth followed.
The said imperial crown and other the premises shall be to the Lady Elizabeth, the King's second daughter, and to the heirs of the body of the said Lady Elizabeth, lawfully begotten, with such conditions as by his Highness shall be limited by his letters, patents under his great seal, or by his Majesty's last will in writing signed with his gracious hand.
Here too, Henry retained the right to set conditions. Mary later attempted to enforce such conditions by making Elizabeth promise to remain Catholic. However, Elizabeth did not consider herself legally bound by this promise and was, from a legal standpoint, correct. It is suggested that Elizabeth chose to remain childless to maintain complete control over the succession, thereby avoiding the same issues faced by Edward and Mary. Let us now turn to why these regulations were extremely intelligent. As the sole heir, Edward would have been a prime target, especially as a 6-year-old when the new regulation was passed. Without a clear succession plan, the crown might have fallen to Margaret Tudor's daughter Mary, later known as Mary, Queen of Scots. Reginald Pole and Edward Courtenay could also have staked claims. In the worst case, there could have been a repeat of the Wars of the Roses. Henry needed to ensure a clear line of succession with an undisputed claim, and to make the alternative to Edward's rule less appealing than waiting for him to come of age. Henry had learned from the fate of the princes in the Tower. Mary was ideally suited to solve these issues. At 28, when the law was passed, she was politically well-connected, supported by the Habsburgs, and wealthy. Henry ensured, through his will, that she was one of the richest landowners in the country. Mary accepted Edward as the legitimate heir, partly because her mother had died before Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour. She liked Edward's mother and played a central role in Edward's life. As a Catholic, she posed such a significant threat to leading Protestants that she was unlikely ever to sit on the throne. In essence, she was the perfect guarantee for Edward's survival. As the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, endowed with her parents' stubbornness, she would do what she thought was right. Her actual life impressively underlines this. Henry faced two problems: how to include Mary in the succession without excluding his other illegitimate daughter, Elizabeth, and how to prevent Mary from returning to Catholicism after his death, antagonizing the Protestants. Including Elizabeth in the succession solved both problems. Elizabeth was too young to guarantee Edward's survival herself, but could serve as a check on Mary as long as she remained childless. The theory was that Henry would stipulate Mary couldn't revert to Catholicism without forfeiting the crown, thus elevating Elizabeth. This arrangement provided a security guarantee for the Protestants. Mary's rule later showed this calculation worked. From Henry's perspective, the only flaw in the law was that it didn't grant Edward the right to impose conditions on Mary's inheritance of the crown. Legally, it's debated whether Edward inherited this right by receiving all his father's rights and titles. Edward seemingly didn't believe so, as otherwise he wouldn't have needed the device for the succession. This topic merits further discussion in the future, which we will do. To reiterate, Henry brought this situation upon himself. Without his actions, a legitimate son wouldn't have been necessary. The question is, when his desire for a son shifted from personal wish to dynastic necessity. This likely occurred after Elizabeth's birth. It's hard to imagine Mary accepting Anne Boleyn's daughter as the primary heiress. Similarly, making Mary the heir while ignoring Elizabeth would have caused massive problems among English Protestants. Counterfactual history lovers might ponder what would have happened if Henry had a surviving son with Anne Boleyn. I don't have an answer to that. Until Elizabeth's birth, Henry's desire for a son was largely due to the tradition that women weren't considered fit to rule in England. Henry wasn't the first king to overlook older daughters in favor of a son. However, his ruthless and brutal treatment of both the mothers and daughters sets him apart and provides insight into his view of women. From 1533 onwards, a son from a legitimate marriage was crucial for ensuring a stable succession. Edward was indispensable for the survival of the Tudor dynasty.